Yes. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Dr. P. Dominique Paterano. I'm the president and founder of in Coaching, which provides academic tutoring in all subjects, test prep for things like the SAT, GRE, and college essay coaching, as well as college counseling for students applying to college. And I invited Dr. B, I'll introduce him in a moment. I invited him to be here today because as also a certified yoga teacher, I'm very attuned to the issue of anxiety. And I've been helping students deal with their anxiety, I would say, since I became a certified yoga teacher about a dozen years ago. But I've definitely noticed, as I'm sure those of you who are in the audience and who are also test prep professionals, you've noticed that there's been a real uptick during, and post-COVID. And so I'm sort of the believer the more tools I can have in my toolbox of how to help kids, the better off I am. So I wanted to I read Dr. B's book, and I wanted to have him here to speak with you. So Ben Bernstein, PhD, is a senior psychologist and educator specializing in top performance. Known as the stress doctor, he's the author of 4 books on how stress affects performance, including Crush Your Test Anxiety, which was published in 2018 and is now available as an online course at DrBYourbest.com. So DrBeYourBest.com. Recipient of the 2023 Bowdoin College Distinguished Educator Award, Dr. B works with a wide variety of test takers, from teens preparing for their SAT for the very first time to aspiring doctors studying for their boards. Thank you and welcome, Dr. B.
Thank you, Dr. P. And it's great to be here.
Good. So I thought maybe we could just start out for those who may not be familiar. If you can define what is test anxiety for us?
Sure. So test anxiety is usually thought of as a psychological condition. In 40 years of doing this work, I'm broadening that out a bit more, and I'll explain that as I go. Basically, what it is a fear, stress, nervousness as related to taking an exam or to a quiz or to an evaluation or a presentation. So it's a buildup of fear and all the symptoms of that, which I think we'll get into, before some kind of presentation or some kind of evaluative experience.
And speaking of the signs, so how would a parent or a teacher or a tutor or even a student themselves know if they suffer from test anxiety? What are sort of some of those outward signs or inward signs?
Sure. Well, I mean, the simplest answer to that question is if you're asking a couple of things here which are important, which is how would a parent know or a teacher know, and how would a student know?
Right.
Sometimes students know a lot sooner than a parent or teacher does because they don't necessarily show the symptoms. So I'm going to actually start with the student, which is just basically dreading taking a test, really not wanting to take a test, being afraid of not being able to answer questions, being afraid of the outcome. So those fears are really important because that will give a clue right away. If a student really doesn't want to take a test, is frightened about it, that's one thing. But there are other symptoms as well, and this is where it's more than a psychological condition. There are physical symptoms, headaches, stomach aches, tension, any kind of bodily activity that seems particularly amped up. Now, I would say it's important throw in a caveat here, which is that any performance situation is going to prompt a rise in energy. We know this from over 100 years of research of how stress affects performance. It's a bell curve relationship studied by two psychologists early in the 20th century. So too much stress, one tail of the bell curve, or too little stress, the other tail of the bell curve, performance goes down. But then there's just the right amount of stress. And I actually call that energy when a person, not to be confused with anxiety, that you have to get kind of pumped up before you do something. But when that pumped upness becomes fear-driven, I'm not going to be able to perform. So that touches on the next issue or symptom, as you would say, which is negative thinking. I'm not going to do well. I haven't studied enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not going to be able to figure out difficult questions. And then the third symptom of test anxiety, and these really do go together, is a difficulty staying focused, meaning that getting distracted quite easily. Focus is a really important part of this whole process of test taking, because for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, in some cases a few days, you have to stay very focused when you take a test. Now, focus requires having a goal and then actions that take you to the goal. So in fact, focus is a noun and a verb. The noun is the goal, and the verb is taken to the goal. Now, as far as students are concerned, the goal has to be their goal. In other words, I've had kids come to me with their parents. One notable example is a student sitting down and saying, I said, why are you here today? And she said, well, my mother wants me to get a higher SAT score. Well, that is not that's not good grounds for the student actually taking charge herself and, moving in the direction. So there's the goal. The goal has to be their goal. And there's also taking actions that get you to the goal, which means staying connected, not getting distracted. This is a really big issue, because when we're in an anxiety situation or a potential anxiety situation, the tendency to get distracted is enormous. And students have a whole variety of ways of getting distracted. The biggest one, being this, that they just, they just veer off the page and check their texts and check their social media. And none of that behavior actually helps during the test. So, I'm going to shorthand this for teachers, parents, and students, that symptoms of test anxiety would be that you're not calm, that you're not confident, and that you're not focused. Okay? So I put those all in the negative, because what they all suggest is a kind of disconnection. You don't want to be there. You don't want to take the test. Okay?
This is so interesting. So based on what you said, I just have a couple of follow-up questions.
Go right ahead.
Because most students, I would say probably 99% of students don't inherently like tests. There are weirdos like us in Test Prep Tribe who actually kind of thrive on testing situations, and that's why we became test prep tutors, right? But I would say there have got to be students who just don't like tests, but don't have test anxiety. So my first question is, how do you parse out the difference of what's a normal pre-test jitter and then what's test anxiety? And then my other question is, and this one might be too difficult to sort of answer within the time frame we have today, but because ADHD also involves lack of focus, how can you parse out, does a student have ADHD or does the student have test anxiety?
Okay, well, you've asked two very big questions. So I'm happy to tackle them. Let's go one by one. Give me the first one again, please.
Difference between normal pre-test jitters that most kids have and test anxiety.
Well, that's what I was, thank you for, I like the way you qualified it, normal pre-test jitters. I reframe that, and I think it's an important reframe, that important pre-test jitters are just the ramping up of energy that you need to have before a performance situation. You need to have that kind of energy going into this. Athletes talk about this all the time, right? Before a big game or before, I've coached Olympic athletes to little leaguers. It's the same kind of thing. So that's not the same as I really, really dread this. I don't want to be here. I'm scared. That's quite different. Okay. As to your point that most people don't like to take tests, that's probably true. That, is a much longer discussion about how that evolves, which is tests can be very informative. Not only that, but tests are here. They're here to stay. The SAT and ACT may and have gone through different evolutions and tests, optional, that kind of thing. But life is filled with tests every single day. When people come to me, parents bring a student to me, and I explain to them, I want you to get higher score. I want you to have a better test experience. But why I'm really doing this is because I'm teaching life skills of dealing with challenging test stress-provoking situations. You're going to be facing them every single day. And I think particularly for high school students going off to college, honestly, they don't have a big toolkit of how to deal with challenge or stress. So I set the stage for that by saying, hey, I know you don't like to do this, but this could really be helpful to you in the longer term, that you're going to learn some helpful tools. And I've had people come back to me, 10, 20 years later, saying, I'm still using the tools you gave me.
Right.
Okay. So, Okay. On to the second question.
And how can we parse out the difference if one of the signs of test anxiety is lack of focus, and that's also a sign of ADHD? How do we know if a student might have ADHD or test anxiety?
Well, that's a good question. It's a little knotty, Knotty. Let me see if I can untie that knot a little bit. I do have some very strong views about ADHD, meaning that in 40 years of doing this, I have seen that diagnosis misapplied to a lot of students. Okay, so, and I'm not saying that it's a bogus diagnosis. I'm just saying it's been misapplied. Mm-hmm. People for all kinds of reasons that are not necessarily neurological, get branded as ADHD so that they can get extra time and all of those things. And some of that, I'll just say a couple more words on this. Some of that has origins in a lot of what goes on in a lot of schools is not very engaging, and students' attention starts to wander. I was called into a meeting for one student, very bright kid, with his teachers, and it was a meeting to go over his curriculum, special curriculum. And they were all saying he can't pay attention. He doesn't pay attention. He's not paying attention. And I stopped the meeting and I said, hang on, he's paying attention to something, right? What is he paying attention to? Well, it turned out this kid, when things weren't engaging in the classroom, he had this imaginary portal that he went through into a much more interesting world. And this is not, I wouldn't qualify this, I would qualify this as imaginative rather than as ADHD. So back to the question, I think if somebody is going to have a diagnosis of ADHD, it really needs to be understood as some kind of condition where the brain is not all coordinated in the way that it might be. And I think that you have to be very careful about that. I don't think that we really train students to be focused. I don't think that we train them to, and often that's because we're asking them to do things that are just not that engaging, and their attention wanders. This is a big statement, but I have been teaching for 50 years in 3 different countries, and I had this myself. As a kid, I just couldn't. It was a rare teacher that got me inspired and got me engaged and got me, working, right? So, it's a complex issue. I would not revert if a kid doesn't have has difficulty focusing, I would not revert quickly to the diagnosis of ADHD. I would side with them that it's hard to be focused on things that you don't like.
Right.
So this is something you got to do. Do you want to do it? Do you want to get the score you need to get into the college that you need? Let's figure out how you can, rather than assume you can't because of some condition that you actually may not have.
Interesting. So is there a typical profile of a student who might suffer from test anxiety? And what do you think are maybe some of the factors that contribute to it, other than perhaps the boring nature of many of the tests and schoolwork?
Right. Well, a profile. So, in my work, this model that I've developed over all these years, which is basically what I train people in. It's a model. It's a performance model. And the performance model is based on reducing your stress so that you can improve performance, going back to the original scientific correlation between stress and performance. We want to keep stress at an optimal level. So the typical profile would then be easy to define by way of what's going on when you take a test. So I'm going to actually pull up a model here that I work with all the time, which is this three-legged stool. Okay. Yeah. So when you go to take a test, or when you're on the athletic ball field, or you're in front of a courtroom, or you're with your children, or you're in the car, there's always three parts of you. There's your body, your mind, and your spirit. Okay. So when you're asking about the typical profile, test anxiety can show itself up in 1, 2, or 3 of these. In the body, it would show itself up as tension, nervousness, aches and pains, a general jitteriness. That's all physical. In the mind, the way test anxiety would show up is a default to the place of, I can't do this. I don't know what to do. I'm not good enough. It's all I can't, and I don't, or I'm not. Okay. And then in the spirit leg, which is the one that we talk about the least, and I think is actually the most important, is when you don't have a goal, or the goal is not your goal, and you get distracted. Okay. Not for the reasons that you were just citing, but that you just get distracted. It's hard to stay focused. Now, so it can show up as body, mind, or spirit, or all 3, or 2 of the 3. When all 3 are equally strong, this is a very, very sturdy platform. But when one leg starts to give out, I'm holding my breath, I'm tensing up my shoulders, it's going to affect the other 2. That's how it works. That's how we work. We're a dynamic system. Similarly, you may be calm generally, but you might be beset with all kinds of negative thoughts. Usually that's trigger a physical reaction also, but sometimes not. You just have negative thoughts, right? That will also cause this. If you get a question that looks very difficult on the test, and the first thing you say is, I can't figure this out, your focus is going to go right off the question and onto what the consequences of getting a wrong answer are. Oh my God, I'm not going to get the score I want. I won't get into the college. My parents will be angry. All of that. Okay. So the profile is varied, but it's always within these bounds. It's always something physical and or something, I'm going to say mental thinking, cognitive, or it's something on the level of spirit. Just one more thing about the spirit. We're very averse, if not phobic, to talking about the spirit. This is an important but complex issue. We tend very quickly, too quickly, to just attach it to religion or religious practice. Now, I'm a very deeply spiritual person. I have a number of practices, but that's not exactly what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about when I say spirit is the part of us, you, me, all the people that we work with, that fires us up, that inspires us, that is the motivating factor for doing well. That's your spirit. It's not your mind. Okay? Sports psychology for years has focused on the body-mind connection. Mind of steel, mind of whatever. they're leaving out the spirit. And what drives sports more than anything is the spirit. It's the spirit that wants you to get stronger, that wants you to get more fit, that wants you to do your very best. So all of that is the case. Now, just one more thing about how would you know? What would you see? I mean, an excessive concern about results, meaning that one of the things that I feel happens way too much, and I certainly get this in my office, and I spoke about this at the NTPA conference in Dallas, is we have in this culture an excessive focus on score, outcome. Now, score is important. Colleges may well have a cutoff. Score is very important. But what's more important is you focusing on being able to answer questions, being able to stay calm and confident and focused, being present. Score is in the future. Score is an outcome. It's actually not a goal. And I think there's a big confusion about this. If we make it a goal, the student is going to be thinking about the score over thinking about, like, what's this question in front of me? It's a subtle thing that is extremely important, I have found over the years. When I detach people from the score, I want you to get that score. I want you to get a 1550 or a 34 or 35. Absolutely. But we have to focus on what you need to do to answer questions accurately. That's right. A different story. Okay. Yeah. So that would be my last thing to be aware of, is kind of a hyper concern about outcome.
And so, this kind of moves into my next question. I'm glad you just mentioned that. So other than telling students, don't be so concerned about the outcome, right? Which is a very difficult thing to do, right? I mean, I go back to my yoga training, right? And I had to read Bhagavad Gita and learn about detaching from an outcome and just sort of learn to enjoy the process. But I was 40 when I went through that. And we're dealing with kids who are 16, 17. So what are some steps that parents, teachers, tutors, or even students themselves can do to reduce test anxiety in the longer term? I'm not talking about like right when the test is in front of them, but sort of in the even years, months and years leading up to a big test like the SAT.
Okay, so your questions are great, Dr. P, because they have multiple opportunities for me to answer and to give some thought to these. First thing you said is, if we tell students, I forgot how you're phrasing, but it was like, don't be concerned about it. I would never say don't to a student, because that's immediately going to, like, what do you mean don't think about it? That's what I think about it. It's just going to flip to the other side. Always think about what you can do rather than what you shouldn't do. This is the first thing, okay? So if a student is very excessively concerned about score, and I have to say immediately that sometimes parents are more concerned about score than the students are concerned about score.
Yes.
And what I say to them is the same thing as I say, I know you want your daughter to get this score. I totally get it. I understand that. But we have to focus on what she needs to do to achieve that score, right? So there are a lot of subtle things here. I may be veering off your question, but there are a lot of subtle things here. Often when students and professionals, when they take licensing exams, on practice exams, they'll do a question and they'll flip to the answer to see if they got it right.
Yeah.
This is a very unproductive way of preparing for a test. You can't do that when you're taking a test. Yeah. So if you have developed a habit of doing that in the practice, for sure, and I say this from experience, when you're in the actual test experience and you can't do that, you're going to feel anxious because you're not getting the immediate feedback that you trained yourself to be in. Don't do that. Okay, here's a don't. Don't do that. Another thing to say is just stay connected. So if you want to check answers, Okay, decide in the early stages, I'm going to check after every 5 or 10, and you keep increasing it until you don't have to check. Okay? Now, I've really strayed from your question, which I'm going to have to ask you to.
That's okay. What can parents, teachers, tutors
Oh,
do
yeah.
to help students in the long term
Okay.
less anxious?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I was focusing on the question, but
Yeah.
but
Yes.
borrowing into. Well, I think the best answer to that question is to stay in the present. When you take a test, or when you're in a big football match or a swimming meet, the only place you can actually be at that moment is in the present. And everything that I do in the course, in the books, is a training for being in the present. So what parents can do when a child, understandably, and I'll say why it's so understandable, it gets concerned about score and outcome. But the parent can do is say, no, I know you're just like what I'm saying. I do. I say, of course you're concerned about that, but let's really focus on what you need to do right now. So if a student is studying for, say, math section of the SAT, and there's a particular set of questions that have to do, say, with intermediate algebra or something like that, that the student is stuck on, okay, let's really work on that. Let's find out, let's move it from this kind of global, oh God, I can't stand tests and I don't want, something specifically has to be focused on. That's present time. Bring your student back to the present, right? Tutors can be very adept at this. I know because over years and years I've been working with students who tutors refer to me. And my preference always, when I get a student referred by a tutor, is actually get the parents' permission that I can work directly with the tutor so that we can all coordinate. And I've just seen tutors get thrown by this kind of anxiety when they actually know really what to do, which is let's focus on what you need to do right now. Right now, that's one thing. The other thing is to be attentive to these different signs that we were talking about. So physically, if your student is, as a tutor or as a parent, if your student is all jittery, introduce them. Now there's so fabulous apps that you can introduce them to help them to calm down. You have to make the case that the jitteriness is not going to help them. The best way of making that case is to look at Olympic athletes. Everyone has seen, at the Summer Olympics, the diver who's walking to the end of the board, and the very last shot is of her face. And it's not all like this. It's like calm. Okay? How do they do that? Well, they train to do that. So these are good models. You can also use good models for this. So learning tools. This is the course. There are 9 tools, actually. 3 for being calm, 3 for being confident, 3 for being focused. And parents can learn these tools. In fact, a chapter in the book is all for parents. The course, you can easily learn the tools, and you can help your student. You will see, if you watch carefully, for instance, in the calm leg, the student may just stop breathing. Well, that's immediate cause for stress getting spiked. That's one thing. The other thing is in terms of confidence. Student says, I can't do this. I don't know. I'm not good enough. Parent or a teacher or tutor knows the student in a much larger context than this one example. And you must bring in, not Pollyannish, oh, you're a fabulous kid. You're the best. None of that. That just washes right over people's head. But to say things like, I've seen you handle some really challenging situations specifically, and you cite one. This is another one of those, okay? And then for focus, you really have to work with students to improve their ability to stay connected. How do you do that? The way I do it is very simply. Okay, so turn off your ringer on your notifications on your phone, but turn on the timer. And let's start with 10 minutes. You're just going to work for 10 minutes, and then you take a little break. We want to build them up, obviously, to 30, 40 minutes without taking any break, because that's more like under test conditions. So there's a lot of things that you can do. And again, we don't teach this stuff, and I wish we did.
Absolutely. I mean, I know that I myself, as a tutor, and when I used to be a full-time classroom teacher, I used to do breathing, but
Right.
I'm a yogi, so I'm sort of more into that myself. And I call myself a recovering perfectionist. And that came with a fair amount of anxiety for myself.
Sure.
But sometimes I think it can be very difficult for, say, teachers who are dealing with, say, 25 students at a time to
Yeah.
recognize that. And even for a tutor, sometimes, we're not always there when the kid is actually taking the test. So we don't, for example, I never even sort of thought about, oh yeah, some of my students may be checking their answers one at a time as they go, because that's something that I would never do.
Sure.
But of course, people who are tutors, I don't know if we like tests, but we generally probably did well on tests. So
Yeah.
we never had that lack of confidence. And so we didn't need that immediate feedback of, oh, did I get this right? Because we knew we probably did get most of them right. Right.
Right.
And that's why we went into the profession we went into. So I think it's really important to think about those things. That's
Def-
great.
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah. So before we get to, and we are going to, there's already a question that did come in from an audience member in the chat. And if any of the others of you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat as well. I just have one last question, which is, let's say, there's the SAT coming up on Saturday.
Right.
Many of our students are going to be taking it.
Yeah.
So if there is one thing that we could tell our students in order to mitigate anxiety on this test or any other test coming up, what could a student actually do when they're in that testing situation if they encounter a question that just makes the sirens start going off in their brain?
Well, specifically to answer your question, you need to tutor, and I know tutors do this, but parents, you need to tell the student to expect that there will be questions that will be very difficult or they may not have seen before. You have to be realistic about this. A good test will always include something that you have never seen before. But what you have to remember is that you have been in this material. Hopefully you have prepared and studied and practiced, and they're not going to ask you a botany question in the middle of an algebra section. That's not going to happen. Whatever question is asked is going to relate in some way to something you have already studied and you have already prepared. And the key there is when you see it and you think, oh my God, I don't know what this is. Of course, that's a natural reaction. The key is not to keep staying disconnected. Oh my God, I can't figure this out. My score is going to go down. That disconnection, whoa, 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 you just get further and further out in that bell curve. Rather than just acknowledge, I don't know what this is. But remember that it has to be related to something that I do know. And when I slow down and when I, exhale and really ground myself, I can see the things in the question, in the problem, that are related to what I do know. And slowly you can piece it back together. Now, slowly is a tricky word because you're being timed. So in answer to your question, the real answer to your question is, it's very hard for a student to implement something the day before taking the SAT or the ACT that they haven't practiced. It's just very, very hard, because they're overwhelmed. So I say, you need to really be practicing these tools all along the way so that when it happens, you do. Now, I'll give you another example. And this is something you can do. But again, my experience is that trying to implement something the day before, the night before, the week before is a tough one. But one thing that I train students in, I've talked to tutors about this, is what I call 3-point breathing. 3-point breathing is that you exhale 3 times. You exhale before you read a question. You exhale before you read the answer choices, and you exhale after you bubble in an answer. So what is this all about? Well, I've watched test takers for years and years and years, and the first thing that they do, here's an example test, okay? So the proctor gives out the test and says, begin taking the test. And the student, watch me carefully, the student opens the booklet and goes, So, if I ask an audience, what did you see? They say, well, you freaked out, you hit the wall, all that's accurate. But what I really did was I just held my breath. Okay? When you hold your breath, the brain gets the signal that you're dying. Is your stress going up or down? Up, going down, performance down. And this continues for 3 or 4 hours. No wonder people are exhausted by the end of a test. Okay? So that is something you can certainly incur if it's a last minute sort of thing, which I don't advocate, but if you need to do something, that's a good thing to do. Just exhale, exhale, exhale. So you're regularizing your breath. You're not turning on the sympathetic nervous system unduly.
Okay, that's great. Great. Well, thank you. This has been great. I'm going to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. So the first question that came in, and I have my own opinion on this, Dr. B, but I'd like to see what your thoughts are. Is there ever a point where, as a test prep tutor, where we should advise the parent to have the child seek psychological help for their test anxiety? I am not a psychologist nor have any formal training. So I always wonder, is it my place to work with a student on test anxiety, or is it beyond my abilities?
It's such a good question. It's a very thoughtful question, and I'm glad it's being asked. No, your training is different than, a psychologist than mine. But I want to move away from test anxiety being simply a psychological condition, because there are things that you can do. If a student is excessively jumpy, you can help her or him to calm down, right? You can use the tools for calming down. I didn't invent the tools, but I put together a system that comprehensively covers all three. This is in the course and in the book. The course is actually a more updated version. I wrote the book quite a while ago. So yeah, there are things that you can do. As per the question, when do you refer out? There are different, I would say there are different markers of this. Sometimes there will be family dynamics that are way beyond the purview of a tutor. In other words, pressures, from parents, from one parent, not the other, from divorced parents. I mean, there could be a number of factors that are affecting the student that you really can't address within the context of tutoring. So family dynamics are one. To some extent, a negative history with tests may need to be more addressed by a professional, by a psychologist or a counselor, than by you, because it's almost like it's like a mini, or maybe not even so many, PTSD kind of thing that has to be really dug into and addressed in a certain way. There may be some real cognitive issues involved, right? In terms of how a student learns or how a student processes information. I would say, as a little sidebar here, I have a real thing about the diagnosis of slow processing speed, because it's like, who said it has to be fast? I mean, where is that coming from? These are norms that get set up, that kids are boxed into. And, sometimes people, myself included, take time to think. Oh my God, is this like a bad thing? No, it's not. I study music with a very, very top-notch, because I compose music, a top-notch teacher. He goes way too fast for me. I mean, way too fast. And I finally, yesterday in my lesson, we slowed down, and it was such a joy because I was really getting it. Okay? So our societal compulsion for speed is can wreak havoc.
I'm with you. I recently read a neuropsych eval for one of my students, and she was diagnosed with slow processing speed. And I just said to myself, gosh, I think this kid is such a thoughtful, deep thinker. And that thoughtful, deep thinking requires time. And I know, even for myself, I listened back to, you and I were both interviewed by Amy Seeley and Mike Bergen on Test and the Rest podcast. And I listened to my more recent one. I was on twice, and I realized, gosh, talk more slowly than a lot of people, which is funny because I'm a New Yorker and I do lots of things very quickly. But I realized that I felt like I was talking very slowly, but I realized, oh, I just wanted to be, because the topic was diversity in the college essay after the Supreme Court decision that banned race in affirmative action. And I wanted to be very precise and thoughtful in the words I chose. And that's why I wasn't speaking as my New York Minute type of speech. So I agree with you. I think it's not always a great thing.
Now, having said that, the reality of a test is that it's time-based. Okay, so there are, and this is what tutors can be particularly good at, teaching students shortcuts, teaching students ways of that may move them out of their normal, slower thinking. I don't even like to use the word slower, but more considerate kind of thinking, because it is time. So you need to know some shortcuts. You need to know how you can get into this without pressuring yourself. It's the pressure to go quickly that really gets in the way.
Yeah. And I would also add to the person who mentioned this, just as, I've been tutoring for over 30 years now. And certainly as I got into middle age, I became more comfortable broaching the topic with the parent of the potential need for some sort of psychological intervention. But there are some parents that are going to be very resistant to that. And I would say, if our first priority is helping the child, then doing things like the breathing exercises, which, don't require your level of psychological training. If even that tool, I also have given one of my students journaling exercises to boost her confidence, because I realized that low confidence was part of it. I think those are all, I don't mean to be a psychologist in any step. I just want to help kids. And, sometimes, unfortunately, a parent doesn't want that. And to that point, I'd want to get to our next question, because another question came in. Oh, sure.
Which is that I've had that experience frequently over 40 years of parents who bring their kids to me specifically because they've heard that I don't slap a diagnosis on the kid. And part of the, I would not even want to suggest that, that's what psychologists do, but that's the fear that the kid's going to get branded with a certain diagnosis, and the diagnoses stick. Yeah. And so I understand the parents, that way, that the student needs compassion for understanding what's going on with her or him. That's what they need more than anything else, rather than like, what's going off the rails here. Right. So, the more compassionate you can be, and tutors are compassionate. You don't have to have a PhD in psychology. I got off being a therapist early on in my career because I wanted to more move into the space of what do we need to do for you to perform at your best. So rather than looking backwards, we're looking forwards. And what habits are getting in your way? And habits are either productive or unproductive. They're not good or bad. We all have lots of unproductive habits that we keep throwing in our way of really being and becoming our best self. This is basic, right? So to look at things more like habits and problems, that can go a long way. And tutors can be very good at that. You don't need a PhD in psychology. You need to look at the habits that a student has. Now, again, if it appears or feels like, well, this is pretty deep, it's deeper, I just don't know what to do. So before you send the parents to a psychologist with the kid, call a psychologist, call me, set up a little a 20-minute, complimentary consultation. And I have a pretty good idea right away if this is something that a licensed psychologist should deal with. Okay, thank you for letting me more fully into that.
Thank you. So the next question we got reads, I work with younger students aged between 9 and 13,
Yep.
and often their test anxiety is obvious to me before their parents are ready to accept it. Do you have any golden nuggets when parents are hesitant to acknowledge their students' anxiety, or worse yet, when the parents are actually worsening the anxiety with their messaging to the students?
Well, I'm going to just rest on the phrase golden nuggets. If I had golden nuggets, I probably wouldn't be on this webinar today. So I love that phrase. So let's think about that question. It's a good question. Parents love their children. They want their children to do well. This is somewhat complex because sometimes it's really not about the child, it's about the parents and the way a child reflects back to the parents. Okay, so that's a tough one, yeah, because so often parents think it's about the child, but it's really more about them in some cases. Okay, so I think the question is, what do you do when you have a parent who is so gung-ho, pushy, determined that the kid does well? Is that the nature of the question?
Yeah. Do you have any golden nuggets when parents are hesitant to acknowledge their students' anxiety? I'm assuming so that they can acknowledge it. And then also when the parents actually worsen the anxiety with the messages that they give.
That's a two-part question. The first part has to do with okay, repeat that again. I want to make sure I'm getting it. Could you just repeat that? The first part of the question.
Do you, and I can also put this in the chat.
No, you don't need to. Go ahead. Yeah.
Do you have any golden nuggets when parents are hesitant to acknowledge their students' anxiety?
So I absolutely would side with the parent at that point. If you pick up that the student is suffering from test anxiety, and you start to pick up that the parent is hesitant or resistant to that, you side with the parent right away. It's so hard to see your kids suffer. I totally get it. We don't want our children to suffer. So that's one thing. The other thing, which is a bit deeper and more related to the parent, is the parent's own potential insecurity about themselves as a parent, that in some way is reflecting on them. And in that way, you can also talk about that we often have, we often mix up a child's success with our own success. It's a different, child is an independent person. She or he has to grow and is growing and has to grow into who they are. So part of being a parent is successively over time to let go, to recognize that this is a separate person, and that it doesn't help the student if you are denying the student's reality. Much better to say, here's to the parent, here's what I'm seeing. What do you see? Don't make the parent wrong. I don't think tutors would do that. But here's what I'm seeing. What are your thoughts on that? Now, they may not see that at home. The child may be not wanting to show the parent that they're anxious because of fear of reprisal, who knows what, right? But I think sharing with the parents, in a sense, siding with the parents, is important. There's something called the induced reaction in psychology, which is that when we're in the force field, if you will, of someone who's anxious, often we'll feel anxious, right? Mm-hmm. So rather than to recognize that's a diagnostic sign, wow, you're really anxious because I started feeling anxious, but I'm not going to stay there. I want to help you. Talking to parents about that, of course you get worked up when you see your child anxious. Much better that you really stay calm and that you really can be there for your student. So that's about as golden nugget as I can get, but it's it's challenging for parents. And the whole thing about college entrance exams, SATs, the child is on the threshold usually of leaving home. This is a major thing. This is major. It's not your child, but it's their child who's not going to be at home. And you know how family dynamics work, that pillar of the family and whatever it's holding up is going to be gone. So that provokes a lot of anxiety. So you kind of have to dig around like what's going on here to do. Yeah, and then to talk about that, yes, of course, if you're anxious, it's going to affect your child. How about if you really learn how to stay calm and present, that maybe the child will reflect that rather than your anxiety.
Yeah, it's funny. That conversation I, as a tutor, have had less success in, but I've had a lot of success in broaching the I'm not a psychologist, but this is what I'm seeing. And based on my X number of years in the field of education, this doesn't appear to be typical, but, maybe, sometimes I have referred the parent to outside psychologist. And I have to say, in almost every time one time I heard back, oh, my kid's teacher also said that, but she's only 24 years old and has 30 kids in the class, so I just disregarded it.
Right.
So it's not like and another time the parent had an inkling that the child had some attention difficulties, right? But because, they were very high performing parents, high performing older brother. They might have been a little bit more reluctant until I said, well, this is what I'm seeing. So just anecdotally, I think if you can be sort of like an independent arbiter of, I told that one dad who said he'd kind of disregarded the 24-year-old teacher, I said, well, I'm 42 and I'm working one-on-one with your child, and I see that as well. It sort of lent more credence to something else someone else had said as well.
That definitely makes sense. I do have one comment on this as related to what you're saying, which is I think, and I've seen this happen with tutors when I've encouraged them to okay, I'm just going to back up for a minute. When I was trained as a teacher in the late 60s and 70s in very, very progressive schools in very poor neighborhoods in London, if a child wasn't learning something, the first level of dealing with that was to think, how should I be teaching this child differently? It was not what's wrong with this child.
Interesting.
But
yeah.
That is radically different.
Yes.
Radically different. And I want to encourage tutors, I want to encourage all of us that when we're faced with a challenge that we don't think we can handle, to actually step back and take the perspective of this is coming into my circle right now, and I'm in a state of growth. What do I need to do to grow through this? It's quite easy, and take this with a grain of salt. It's quite easy to push it away, to refer it. But how about taking the attitude of, okay, so I'm being presented with this issue. I've been tutoring for a year, 5 years, 10 years. How can what opportunities are presenting to me to grow, right? That I need to do something differently. So that's quite different, but I think it's worthwhile to consider because that's what you're asking the kid to do. You're asking them to take on bigger challenges. So the more you can do that, within limits, of course, you know what I'm saying. So
absolutely. With this boy that I was thinking of, he was 12 and, we would literally take 20-minute breaks. Every 20 minutes, we would get up and play ball in the living room for 5 minutes and I'd let him chase his dog around. And the dad was totally fine with that because he knew his 12-year-old after being in school all day and I'm then asking him to sit at a table. I knew this kid needed to move, right? I've never done that with any kid before or since, but I think it made him hate the tutoring less. It certainly allowed him to get a lot of his energy out in that way. And it focused him for the next 20 minutes.
A great example. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're touching on another thing too, which is the nervous system. Two parts of our nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is what we are when we're in action. Parasympathetic, so it's fight or flight. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. We have to, when a student is really facing a test on a piece of paper, on a screen, they are in their sympathetic nervous system, and that has to get switched off. I have a whole bunch of suggestions about how to do that over the course of a test that don't take up much time at all and make a world of difference. So, you found something, a challenge. This is a great example. I found something in your own work that was a challenge that you figured out, what does this child need? What does this student need right at that moment?
Yeah. Well, we're almost at the top of the hour, so I just want to thank you so much, Dr. B, for talking with us about test anxiety. You know, I mentioned the post-pandemic, so many students are in need of these tips. And I've read Crush Your Test Anxiety. It's a great read, has a lot of actionable insights. So if you're a tutor, I recommend getting that and checking it out on Amazon. And then, of course, Dr. B has his online course for students at drbyourbest.com.
And a short, thank you, Dr. P. A short link to the courses, or courses.drbyyourbest.com. So courses.drbyyourbest.com. And I really would encourage the tutors to look at the courses, and I offer scholarships. I want more people to benefit from this work. Thank you.
Great. And if any of you, this will be posted later on YouTube. If any of you need any academic tutoring, test prep for things like SAT or ACT in hopefully a non-anxious way, or college essay coaching, please feel free to check me out at crimsoncoaching.com or email me directly at info@crimsoncoaching.com. I'm Dr. P. And once again, thank you so much, Dr. B. Have a great day.
My pleasure. Thank you.